Greetings everybody around the world. It's time once again for Ancient Aliens Radio. This is the dedicated radio show for the cast of Ancient Aliens. Here we interview authors and researchers as an ongoing investigation into the ancient alien theory. Don't forget to like us on Facebook or subscribe to the YouTube channel Ancient Aliens Radio. And in just a moment I'm going to be talking to Dr. Bill Birnes. People will know Dr. Bill Birnes from Ancient Aliens and UFO Hunters. And he's the editor of UFO magazine, I believe, and I haven't read it, but I believe it's one of the top magazines in the UK for UFOs. And I'm going to let Bill bring in his bio and tell us everything he does. He's got a very lucrative research career, and this guy is prolific in his research, and he's quite tenacious in finding out the truth and to see what's going on, and we need people like this. So without further ado, let's bring on our guest for today. Hi, Bill. Welcome.
Hi. Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Wow. It's awesome to have you here, Bill. And it's funny. I was watching all those episodes of UFO Hunters long ago, and I never thought I'd be talking to you on the show about it one day. So it's great to have you here today, Bill. And of course, I've been on your show recently, and that was great to do that. So, Bill, you mean for the listeners, you do radio, you do magazines, you do TV appearances. Tell us about your bio. How did you get into all this? What do you do, Bill? What's your aim for all of this?
Well, initially I got into this through the publishing business. I mean, I had been a college professor for more years than I care to remember, and finally, as I was getting a little older, I took a job writing book proposals for a book production company in Princeton, New Jersey. And eventually I began developing a kind of a format, a way to do these proposals quickly, get them to the right people. And I started talking to publishers and making deals for them. And then when he went out of business, Nancy and I formed a company called Shadow Lawn Press. And that was our book production and publishing company. And we had some very good initial success. We've done like 40 books, but we've had some very initial success when I was able to connect with McGraw-Hill, and we produced for them an encyclopedia called the McGraw-Hill Personal Programming Encyclopedia. And this was at a time when personal computers, it was 1981, 82, personal computers were just coming on the market. There were all these different computing languages. There was really no internet at that point, but computers were able to communicate with each other. And we developed this encyclopedia, produced this encyclopedia, and that really launched us in the book production business. And we've never stopped. I mean, we've just kept on going for basically over 20 years. How I get into UFOs was an entirely different story. From the book publishing and production business, I began to sell television movies, and I began to sell some of our books were picked up for motion pictures. And finally, this big television production company said, look, Bill, you did this one book. We want to see if we can make a television series out of it. You knew the guy. Why don't you come out to California for 6 months? Give it 6 months. You don't like it, you go back east. We were living in Manhattan at the time. And we went out there. We drove across country, went out there, and 6 months became a year. In a year, we finally found a house we liked. That became 2 years. And, decades later, we came back here to kind of live in the old neighborhood and be with our kid. But it was being out in California and working with various motion picture production companies that brought me to this guy, Philip Corso, because I was the publishing guy for a lot of these motion picture companies. And it's nothing to do with UFOs, but then I met Phil Corso, and we were going to do a book on Corso's experience in the army as the adjutant in Rome after Rome had surrendered and Mussolini was thrown from power. And we were going to do that book and a book on Americans that were missing in the Vietnam War. So there were these two parallel stories we were pursuing when Corso drops the Roswell bomb and says, I was the guy at the Pentagon who was doing all this research on the stuff they got from Roswell. We're all going, what? Roswell? You're serious? Really? And he starts producing material and congressional testimony and all kinds of stuff. And so I called one of the publishers that I deal with a lot, Simon & Schuster, and they said, and I'd just come off 2 really solid books with them, so they were enthusiastic. And I said, there's this guy, and I explained who Phil Corso was, and Corso had been in the news because he was testifying before Congress, one of the congressional committees, on troops we had that were missing from Korea at the end of the Korean War. Mm-hmm. Well, he suddenly, the cover story on Time magazine and Newsweek. And so Simon & Schuster says, if this guy can do this book with you, and I was originally there as an agent. I wasn't supposed to write it, nothing to do with me. And SNS said, okay, here's the deal. If you write this and can get it into us in time for it to be published by the summer 1997 Roswell 50th anniversary, if you could do that, we're all in. So I went back to the motion picture company that had licensed Phil Corso's rights. It was a motion picture deal ultimately. And I said, look, here's what they laid down. Okay, so you figure this out. We can do the book. We can get the book out by July 1997, but they want me to write it. Up to you. Makes no difference to me. I get a commission either way. So we went to Corso, he said, what did I think was the biggest secret in his book? And I knew that his big thing, the thing that bothered him the most, was the fight between the American CIA, the civilian intelligence agencies, Central Intelligence Agency, and the military intelligence agencies, because Corso was in military intelligence in World War II. So I told him, I will bet, Colonel, that you were trying to keep the secret about what you were doing with the Roswell debris from the CIA more than trying to keep it from the American people. And he said, that's exactly right. Mm-hmm. That's exactly what I was doing. Let's write the book. And that's how I wound up getting into the UFO field.
Wow. Yeah, most people think that you had a dedicated path, but I think you say, you've got suckered into this, you've got drawn in, and I think that's what happens to a lot of people. They look at it and they go, well, there's maybe something here, we'll have a look at it, and all of a sudden it becomes an area of research, and we need people researching this, Bill, from a variety of aspects for a variety of reasons. And I mean, before we get into any of the meat and potatoes, as they say, or the juicy details, but I want to talk about Lloyd Poy, and as you mentioned before the show, Bill, a lot of respect for Lloyd Poy, and I think I was probably one of the last to interview him before he got diagnosed with cancer, and he's sadly gone now, and he was the custodian of the Star Child skull, and just to mark a respect for him here today, Bill, and I know you were a fan of his as well, and as I, so
Well, Lloyd and I were friends, and we did a big cover story on Lloyd in UFO magazine years ago. And Lloyd was my guest on UFO Hunters for in fact, that's the chapter I'm writing as we speak in the second UFO Hunters companion book for Macmillan Tor Forge. I'm writing the Lloyd Pye chapter now because he was such an important guest on the show. Lloyd was truly a gentleman. And the funny thing about Lloyd is that he never really was set out to be a UFO guy. He never really was a guy dealing with alien species. He believed, this was Lloyd's approach to things. He believed that what you were told by official sources served the needs of the official sources. They weren't disclosing anything that didn't really benefit them in some way. And if they did, then they would spin it in such a way as you would appreciate the fact that they were telling it to you. And Lloyd's attitude was, look, there are plenty of things on this planet. You can call it Bigfoot. You could call it the little people. You could call it whatever you wanted. But there were other things on this planet. We were not alone. Forget not being alone in the universe. We were not alone on this planet as a sapient species. And that was Lloyd's theory. Mm-hmm. And then the nurse, Melanie Young, gave him something that changed his life.
Yeah, wow. This is the Star Troll skull.
Yes, it was a skeleton that was found by a teenage girl. She was an American in northern Mexico very early in the 1900s. She found these two skeletons in a cave lying side by side, one kind of enwrapped with the other. It was really kind of a funny position. The one skeleton was a full-size human adult. The other skeleton was, 4 feet, 4.5 feet.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing about that skeleton was it had an odd-shaped skull. So the teenage girl, she scooped up the bones, brought them home to her parents, and over time it was only the skull that survived. But ultimately the parents and she gave the skull for safekeeping to a neonatal nurse, and there's a very important reason for that, a neonatal nurse called Melanie Young, who inspected it, who gave her professional opinion, and then she knew that since Lloyd Pye was a scholar in cryptozoology, that she gave the skull to him to conduct the research on the skull. So Lloyd never saw himself as the owner of the skull. Lloyd always saw himself as the custodian of the skull to get to the bottom of what this skull was, where it was from, was it human, what is it? And that's what Lloyd's mission in life was.
Yeah. I think one of the most important things when I got into Lloyd's work, I read the book, I looked at the skull, I looked at it I'm from an engineering and science background. I applied my logic and reason, and everything that this guy has laid out, Bill, regarding the skull is logical, clear-cut, scientific thought. The skull is symmetrical. He explains why it's anomalous, why it's not a freak of nature, why it's not deformed. And they've wanted to just destroy this thing from the word go, and it's not going away, Bill.
That's right.
Yeah, where's the skull at today, Bill? Do we know? I mean,
well, that's a good point. I mean, one of the things that I was going to do was to contact Melanie Young. We have all the contacts from the show, so I was going to contact her. In fact, I still am, and find out where the skull is and what she plans to do with it. But you pointed out the big thing, one of the big things about the skull was the symmetry of that bone structure. When the people who gave it to Melanie Young, the people who found the skeleton, when they gave it to Melanie Young, they thought that the skull was a skull of a child because it was a child that was close to the woman, and that it had hydroencephaly. Hydroencephaly, or a hydroencephalitic skull, is a skull that has water on the brain that's expanding the brain. And we know that ancient indigenous peoples suffered from this, as well as people today who were born with this, because we have records, and I'm sure you know about this, James, we have records of skull trepanations, drills into the bones of skulls to relieve the pressure from an expanding brain. And so the first thing that this couple thought was that this young skeleton, this young child, was hydroencephalitic and that she was going to get trepanated to save her life. But when Melanie Young looked at let's start with the back of the skull, because one of the things Melanie said to us was, and of course Lloyd Pye said the same thing, is that when a baby is born, there is a separation. It's around the fontanella in the back of the skull. And as the baby moves through the birth canal and the contractions are pushing the baby out, it is slowly but surely pushing the bones together on the infant's head. And it pushes the bones together in a very symmetrical way. With hydroencephalitic babies, because the head is so big, the bone sutures, the bones knit in a totally asymmetrical way. Yeah. One side is longer than the other.
Yeah.
And so, go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just looking at the tree panning thing, the way the bones knit together, the symmetry, the eye sockets, the ear canals. I mean, Lloyd went at this all like 24/7, and when you see him hold it in his hands and describe this, Bill, this is not deformed and it's not a child's skull.
No,
this is.
It is not deformed.
You know, it's like, it's not deformed and it's not a child's skull. It's like, it got a bad name, I think. It got a bad name, Star Child Skull, like, you know, I think. Got a nickname.
Well, that was one of the first things Lloyd went after. He said, how old is this skull? So initially, they thought it was a 5-year-old child with a deformed head. But when Lloyd and Melanie Young talked about the symmetry of the skull and how the bones knit together in a perfect way, perfectly symmetrical way, they realized this was not a hydroencephalic child. Then they did the early biological testing on the skull and found out this was no child. This was not a 5-year-old child. And then the question is, if it's not a 5-year-old child, if it were encephalitic, it would have died. If not at birth, then it would have died shortly after birth. So even if it were 5 years old, it's 5 years old, it shouldn't have been alive. The only medical practice was trepanation, and this skull had no holes in it. So what's going on here? Then they began to talk about the fact that, well, the spine is all wrong. I mean, we'll get to the eye sockets, but the spine was all wrong. The spine, the human skull is supported by the spine in a very specific way. This skull was not supported. First of all, the spine was too thin. So let's, get that out of the way. This was not a human-looking spine. It was too thin.
Mm-hmm.
Then, because the opening in the bottom of the skull was too thin for a regular human spine, even a baby spine. Then it was more to the back of the skull, as if the skull had to be more erect than human skulls are. So it had less flexion than a human skull, than a normal human skull. It was supported in a totally different way, but it was so much bigger than a human skull, roughly 35% bigger than a human skull. Because of that, the way the spine connected to the base of the skull was all length to support that kind of skull. And the other thing was the eye sockets were too thin. They were overly large. Okay, that's within the range of normalcy to have a large eye socket. But they were too flat. They weren't deep like human eye sockets. And so as a result, this is an individual, a life form that had a skull that was too big, 35% bigger. It was not hydroencephalic. The spine connected in a way that would have made it impossible to support a human skull. And the eye sockets were too flat for human eyes. And so those things alone made it very different. Then they began to analyze the bone structure of the skull and found out that it was something like 25% thinner than normal human skulls. Yet it was more dense than normal human skulls. And when they tried to cut a piece out of it with a saw to get it tested genetically, the saw broke.
It's almost like nanotech material, wasn't it?
Well, it was strange. Then inside the bone structure of that skull, and this is what really got Lloyd thinking, where it was almost like a red cord. If you see the inside, there's a red cord running through the bone. And Lloyd couldn't cut that cord. And he didn't know what that cord was because no human skull has that cord. So the next step was genetic testing. So they found out that the skull was stronger than a human skull, more dense than a human skull, that lighter and thinner than a human skull. Then there were all the physical anomalies that were apparent to the naked eye. Then they went after the genetic testing. And they tested some of the stuff from the woman next to where a little creature was found. And what they found out was that the woman next to the thing was a normal human being, one of the haploid races, the Mesoamerican races. But the skull was different. At first, they thought it was a combination of two different Mesoamerican species, haploid A and haploid C. Then, this got to be mysterious. Lloyd said that the skull there were 3 types of DNA normally. I mean, not 3 strands, but 3 different elements of DNA in a human being. There's the father's DNA that's in the nucleus. There's the mother's DNA that's in the nucleus. And then the protoplasm surrounding the nucleus of a cell, that's called the mitochondria. And the mitochondrial DNA has to be the woman's DNA, right? Because it comes from the woman. And that mitochondrial DNA, unless something else is happening, that mitochondrial DNA in a normal birth, a normal fertilized birth, matches the mother's nucleic DNA, right? Because it's the same human being.
Mm-hmm.
When there is a difference between the mitochondrial DNA and the father's nucleic DNA and the mother's nucleic DNA, it generally means there's been in vitro fertilization, that a cell is fertilized outside the womb of the surrogate mother, right? And there's a cell that's taken from a surrogate mother, implanted in the nucleus with the father's DNA and the biological mother's DNA, then reimplanted in the woman, so that the mitochondrial DNA is then different from the nucleic DNA. And so that was the first thing that Lloyd Pye thought and said, but that makes no sense. This was a skull that, when they dated it, seemed to come from the year 1000 or 900. In the year 900 to 1000, did they have in vitro fertilization? I don't think so, right? That's a modern scientific technique. So how could this skull have been artificially inseminated? Wait a minute, he thought. What if this host body had been grown inside a human being but wasn't a human being? In other words, what if an alien had impregnated someone and then that person gave birth to this hybrid? And that was a going theory for a while, but Lloyd was raising money tirelessly. I think it ruined his health, tirelessly, to get a full genome sequence on the skull, or at least a partial. And these are really expensive biological tests to run.
Yeah. Phenomenal.
So,
phenomenal money involved to get that money up. Phenomenal.
But they were able to come up with something. And what they found was that none of the DNA in that entity came from a human being. That the National Institutes of Health, which contains a database of all human DNA, there was no match. How come there's no match to a human DNA? That means only one thing.
Yeah.
And that's what Lloyd was trying to do to get the full genome when he learned that he had contracted acute leukemia and went to Europe for treatments.
Yeah, well, a lot of people would say, that just means it's just an unknown species, but it's an unknown species. You have to understand the DNA evidence. It's an unknown species so far removed from anything we have. Obviously, we're looking at this skull, Bill. It looks like it's something weird and wonderful to physically look at, but the DNA evidence pushes it so far out the genome of the human strains, like it's ridiculously outside. I mean, it's like,
right. You're not talking about something that's normal at this point. You're talking about something that is absolutely abnormal.
Yeah, absolutely abnormal, and genetically and physically to look at, like. So, but it's funny because the fact that it was most likely a surrogate mother employs technology was used to form this creature as well, like, so.
That's right. So even if there had been human DNA in there from the mother, from the mitochondria, it would still be an anomaly, because how could you have in vitro fertilization in some skull you find in a cave from the year 900? It absolutely makes no sense.
I really hope you get involved, Bill, and talk to Melanie and start some dialogue and see what happens, because I would love to see Lloyd Pye's work be continued. Like you say, he was a very graceful and guy full of gratitude, lovely to talk to, very, very nice guy. And he put a lot of time and energy into this, and he left us. He's departed now. He's gone early. He's checked out early, Bill, as they say. But
well, remember, Lloyd Pye set out, and this is what he told us. He set out to prove this was a human skull that was deformed. That's what he set out to do. He was never out to find an alien creature.
Yeah.
And so the more he ran up against what a human test would do, the more he realized this skull wasn't behaving properly. It was not human.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Let's switch gears for a minute, Bill. I want to get into some UFO technologies and cases. I think, I have a whole list here, Bill. I mean, wow. What's your favorite area of research, Bill, in terms of ufology? Big things like either Roswell, Arizona Lights. What's your favorite, Bill?
Well, here's the deal about something like Roswell. Since I came from a true crime writing background, the psychology of criminal behavior, since I came from that background, and I dealt with I worked for the U.S. Department of Justice for a while, doing grant work with them. One of the things and I finally wrote the book with the detective who caught the serial killer, Ted Bundy. The book was called Riverman and became a motion picture on A&E. The thing we learned is that when you have a very elusive killer, a Jack the Ripper type, a very elusive killer, strikes at one kind of victim, strikes at victims in a series, when you have that, you always go to the earliest cases because that's where the most evidence is. So when Colonel Corso began talking about Roswell, one of the things I found out from talking to folks like Stan Friedman, Don Schmidt, Tom Carey, Kevin Randall, the real heavyweights in the Roswell field, is that the level of evidence surrounding the Roswell case is astounding. And the evidence falls into all these major categories. There are the eyewitnesses, there are the participants, there's the documentary evidence, official government documents, cables, mails, letters, and then there's the physical evidence. And then there's the attempt by the government to go to all these lengths to debunk the story. It's a weather balloon. It's a mogul balloon. It's a crash dummies. And the debunking was more implausible. In other words, less plausible, but just crazy implausible compared to the facts. For example, the first debunking was at when Jesse Marcel went up to Roger Ramey's headquarters of the 8th Air Force. And there, Roger Ramey supposedly pulled a switcheroo on the debris and put a weather balloon in front of Jesse Marcel, Major Marcel, and said, "Here, smile and say you made a big mistake." But since Jesse Marcel had been he'd been to radar school and he was an intelligence officer, that made no sense that he could misidentify a weather balloon. Signals intelligence used balloons. The other thing you come to find out is that what was a balloon made of in 1947? Neoprene rubber, the same compound that was used throughout World War II. So wouldn't the guys at the 509th know what neoprene rubber is? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, and where do they make the balloons for this? Across the street from the airbase. So the point is, the more you get into this, the more you realize that the evidence was crazy. So we went to Roswell with Philip Corso before 1997. And we were meeting with a lot of eyewitnesses, people who'd actually handled the strange material. And there were so many eyewitnesses and so many places where there were disconnects in the government story that there was no attempt to clean it up. Then we find the diary written by the wife of the sheriff of Roswell talking about the night that Bill Brazel brought the strange box of debris into the jail cell for safekeeping. This was a diary written 20 or so years ago after George Wilcox, Sheriff George Wilcox, died. But the point is, what would have prompted Inez Wilcox to write in a diary? This is before Jesse Marcel went public with his story in Louisiana. Why would she do this? Well, the reason was she had no reason except that it was true. And so that's what really began the trek into the world of UFOs.
Wow. The most striking thing for me about the Roswell thing is that technology has now caught up, and the general that's holding the documents in his arm, they were able to enhance the photograph, and it says key words in the document like disc or crash, and it's not saying anything about weather balloons, Bill, is it?
No, it's not. And the funny thing about, my doubts about the Roswell story, at least Corso's version of the Roswell story, and other people have have said this. This is not some stroke of genius. This is what a lot of people have said. If this craft came from off Earth, why is it that the technology that A, why did it crash? But B, what about the technology we gleaned from it? Wasn't it so basic? I mean, they're still using electronic devices, transistors, things like that. And that was one of the problems that I had, is that why is the technology so close to ours? And then I realized that was just a technology we were able to reverse engineer. There could have been technology so advanced that to this very day, it's still sitting somewhere at Area 51 or Provo or Dugway, Utah, or someplace like that. So it was just, as Harry Truman wrote, President Truman, he wanted the lowest common denominator of technology that was most similar to what we were working on. That's what he wanted us to bring to the folks who were working that technology. So that's why you get this skewed view of what the Roswell craft was all about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what do you reckon to Bob Lazar's story?
Well, Bob Lazar's story is funny. I mean, a person that I'm very friendly with is radio host George Knapp, who was the one who
interviewed him. Yeah.
But not only interviewed him. See, it's a funny story. People think, oh, the guy's crazy. There's nothing. He's a nut. Well, he's a liar. Bob Lazar never set out to tell his story. It was never his intent. Bob Lazar only went public after he was fired from Area 51 because he did something, and he'd be the first to tell you, really stupid.
Yeah.
He was, because he's working, and this part is confirmed. The thing about Area 51 was that the high-level workers there, the scientists, worked at all these odd hours, and they'd leave home at 1 a.m. to be at the base by 3 and spend 36 to 48 hours at the base and then go home. So it was a few days on, a few shifts on, then a shift off. So it wasn't like a 9-to-5 job. That's first of all. Okay. So Bob Lazar was leaving the house at these odd hours, and his wife says, I think you're fooling around on me. He said, no, I got a job, but it's a secret. I can't tell you. She said, well, you're fooling around. And you better fess up. So finally, Bob is wrestling with this because he really loves this woman. And he says, okay, what if I show you what I've been doing? And they bring along this friend, Gene Hoff, almost to be a witness of this thing. Since Bob Lazar knows when they're flying the reverse-engineered alien craft from Area 51, when they're testing it out on a certain night, whether it's Wednesday or Thursday night, he knows where to stand off base so they could see the craft in the sky. He takes them out there. Well, they are blown away. And so, but at the same time, the whole, and I've been to Area 51, all of Area 51 is ringed by sensors, motion sensors.
Yeah. And
it's ringed in the scrub brush. There are microphones. So they heard every word Bob Lazar was saying. They knew who he was. They knew that he was out there. They could hear him talking. Finally, he brings him back again. They call him into the office and said, get off the base. You're done. We know exactly what you were doing. It's over. Well, at that point, he begins talking to people like John Lear, very famous test pilot, son of the founder of Learjets. Talks to John Lear. He's interviewed by George Knapp on KLAS TV. George begins to do his own research. They've expunged every mention of Bob Lazar at Area 51. He's a nowhere man. He's a man without a past.
Yeah.
Except George was able to find him in a telephone directory at Los Alamos, which is where he'd said he'd worked before coming to Area 51. So there was a piece of confirmation. George was looking further, and he found other references to Bob Lazar. He said Bob Lazar's story, at least insofar as its background is concerned, is absolutely true. Yeah, they erased his records, but they forgot to erase these. And that's how the Bob Lazar story became public. It became public, but there was pushback. And Bob finally went into a kind of semi-retirement. He's working on nuclear propulsion systems. And so I tend to agree with George Knapp that the fact that George was able to find confirmation of Bob Lazar rings true for me.
Yeah, and he knows his way around the facility. What was the name of the facility that he worked at? The laboratory?
Well, it was on Area 51. It was Groom Lake. It was Papoose Lake. He worked at a few of those places. Technically, there is no Area 51. It's Groom Lake.
Groom Lake, yeah. Yeah, you know, the thing is as well, like, I mean, you know, Bob Lazar, I mean, it is an incredible story, but, I mean, basically, Area 51 was put on the map because of the Bob Lazar story, yeah?
Well, yeah, I mean...
It wasn't really known about Bill, was it?
No, I mean, first of all, it was never called Area 51. It was called Groom Lake, and it was Nellis Air Force Base. And the reason that there was such an area in the first place, in World War II, it was a gunnery range. So it was a very large area because it was a gunnery testing range. When Kelly Johnson was tasked to develop a unique kind of spy plane, one that could stay aloft for many, many hours, fly very high at very top speeds near the top of the atmosphere. When he was at 100,000 feet, when he was asked to do that, he realized, first of all, his model for it was a UFO, because he had seen a UFO over the Pacific when he was working at Lockheed Skunk Works. He'd seen a UFO that was confirmed by somebody else that was out over the Pacific flying. They both saw the same craft. He copied the design of that craft for his spy plane. The point of it was that, but it was the U-2 that was developed first. And the U-2 had this huge wingspan. Well, because the UFO took so long to take off and so long to land, it had to have huge runways. So Johnson and the CIA, because it was going to be a plane run by the CIA, decided to use this gunnery range. So the gunnery range was, they began to develop this between 1953 and 1954. So it was never developed in 1951. It was 53 to 54, 55. The reason it became called Area 51 in slang was that on the Nevada tax map, which defines squares, parcels of land, this was parcel number 51.
Wow. Let me switch gears on you a second, Bill. I want to jump to another case, and I think this is one of the most fascinating, was the underwater Area 51. You know that place where the cable goes down into the deep Atlantic?
Right, that's OTEC, the Atlantic.
Atlantic OUT.
Undersea, yeah.
OUTEC, sorry, Bill. OUT, OTEC.
Right. Yeah, it's the Atlantic Underwater Testing Facility is what it is.
Yeah, you know, what on earth is going on down there, Bill? Have these guys got like some secret base down there underneath the water? Or?
Yeah, they do. Yeah, they do. I mean, when we were there, first of all, as we approached the gate of that base, I mean, there were helicopters buzzing us like bees, okay? Watching our every move. Like, were we going to break on the base? Were we hooligans or something, going to run on the base? No, I mean, I even said, let's just walk up to the base and ask them to show us the UFO. The guys didn't want to do that, obviously. So we were out in front of the base. Then we went on the water. And one of the things that Pat's a certified diving instructor, a dive master. And so one of the things that Pat did was dive down, and he was following that. I mean, the cable, was like as big as a tree trunk. And he was following it down towards the trench. Obviously, you cannot go into a 6-mile trench. It's a very secret trench. That's a submarine trench, by the way. The subs use that to go in and out of OTEC. But that cable runs along the floor of that trench, and it's our surveillance on the East Coast for protection against any submarines coming into the Gulf of Mexico, coming into the Caribbean. So it's a major facility, and what they are testing is essentially stealth submarines. This is so highly secret. As we were in a motorboat and kind of driving by, when you get too close to the base, you can see the lights go on the SUVs, on the Humvees. You see them manning boats. They were gonna arrest us if we got too close.
Fascinating facility, though. And they're not who they say they are they? The OTEC people.
No, and there are people who say there are UFOs hovering over the place. There are USOs in the water. That what's going on is a relationship between the United States Navy and some kind of alien presence.
Yeah, I think people were talking about some crash up the north coast that they maybe dragged it underneath water and brought it into the facility there.
I keep thinking that if there are such things as unidentified submerged vehicles, USOs, that where the base is would be a perfect spot for them to do whatever they have to do together.
Yeah, undoubtedly. You know, next biggest case, I suppose, is the Phoenix Lights in Arizona, Bill. I mean, you know, a lot of people seen this, Bill. This story won't go away because too many people have seen it. And I guess, you know, the thing that I find most disgraceful is that they tried to dispel it, you know, by the politician guy that came out like.
Right. That's what they did. And not only dispel it. Well, and now that's a funny story too. The guy that came out to crack the joke about what the nature of these lights were over Phoenix was, of course, the state of Arizona governor, Fife Symington. And we interviewed Fife Symington about this. And Fife Symington admitted to us, first of all, he did do it as a joke because he thought that there was so much panic surrounding the event, he wanted to lighten the mood. I have my doubts about that. But,
no, I don't buy that.
Right. But then he said, this was after he was out of office, and strangely enough, remember, when this was going on, Fife Symington was facing some pretty serious corruption charges, right? He was on his way to the pokey.
Really?
Yeah. And one of the things that happened on the day, here's the envelope for that event. That morning, during the whole crazy crisis of the lights flying back and forth over Phoenix, Fife Symington did say, look, I'm going to figure out what's going on. And there's a reason for that. Okay, we'll get to the reason in a second. He said, I'm going to figure out what's going on. Then, according to Frances Barwood, now I didn't know this until the city councilwoman, Frances Barwood, told us this, told me and told James Fox, that Symington had been in court in judges' chambers that day discussing a whole range of things. Comes out, does the news conference with the fake alien. Whoa, that's strange.
Yeah.
Years later, it's now 10 years later, okay, 10 years after the event. It's 2007, 2008 now. Fife Symington publicly admits he apologizes to the folks in Arizona. Now, after this thing with his court case, after his criminal charge, the court overturns his conviction. But the government's going to go back and retry the case. Bill Clinton, President Clinton, gives Fife Symington a full, unequivocal pardon. He can never be tried again on those charges. He's pardoned. Okay?
Wow.
His conviction is erased. Now,
wow.
The thing about this means that Fife Symington is now out from under any obligations he might have made when he was discussing the disposition of his case in judges' chambers.
Unbelievable, this Bill.
So what does he do? He goes public and says, not only do I apologize to the folks of Arizona for having played a horrible joke on you, it was wrong for me to do that, I apologize. He then says, I was an eyewitness to a craft, a spacecraft, an alien craft over my house on the night of the Phoenix Lights.
Yeah. Yeah, I know this part. It's incredibly bizarre about the whole thing. Incredibly bizarre. Well, this aspect of it as well with the governor, but, you know, he insulted a lot of people with that, though. He insulted a lot of people. He insulted people's intelligence, you know, and a lot of people witnessed this, Bill. And, I mean, some people have come up with some crazy theories like it was a hologram and that's why it didn't make any sound, or, I mean, what's your theory on it, Bill?
Well, there are a bunch of theories. First of all, here's what the eyewitnesses say. And I've spoken to I've spoken to Fife Symington. I've spoken to Dr. Lynn Kitai. I've spoken to other witnesses who were up close and personal with this thing. And here's what Fife Symington says, that this thing, several football fields across, in a triangular shape, it's a thing, it's not a light, it's a thing, is floating by his house. And what he's struck by is that in between the lights on the edges, he could see a wavy pattern of stars. It was dead silent. Maybe there was a soft whir, but it just slid on by. Another witness said she was on her balcony. The part about the whole Paradise Valley, Phoenix area is that it's very hilly. And there are people who build their houses right into the hills.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And their balconies hang over the valley. So as these, and they're high up, they could see over to the Austral Mountains and things like that. So they know where things are in their vicinity. As this craft comes in front of this person's balcony, she's almost level with it. Maybe it's 50 feet in the air above her. She's so level, she says, that she could have probably thrown a rock and bounced it off it. And this is a multiple witnessing. So they're having a meeting, like a school board meeting or something, inside the house. They look outside. They see this huge black craft flying right, hovering by the balcony. They go outside to look at it, and they describe it the same way that Fife Symington did, except that this woman, her name is Terry, says that it's wavy and satiny. It's the most peaceful-looking thing, and then it glides on by. The weird thing is, after it glides on by, they go back in the house, and nobody wants to talk about it. It's as if it never happened.
Wow. Do you think this craft could be one of ours, Bill, or extraterrestrial?
Well, my first reaction is that it is one of ours. That it is one of ours for a variety of reasons. We've been experimenting with craft like that for years, right? Neutral buoyancy craft that basically have the ability to be almost stealthy, almost invisible. We have camouflage technology. That's, invisibility technology. We have it. The Russians have it. It's really not that impossibly hard to fabricate. But part of the stealth aircraft, these giant aircraft that we are developing, try to imagine that you want the ability to get a heavy unit of soldiers, a large unit of soldiers from any one spot on the globe to any other spot on the globe in under 24 hours. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right? This would be a perfect way to do it. It's like, you could send in really a hot team on a moment's notice. Is there a civilian purpose to a craft like this? Yeah, think FedEx, think UPS, think any kind of global delivery company.
Mass transport, stealth, everything, it's all there.
All in one. Now, do craft like these fly off at speeds of Mach 5, 6, and 7? They do, if the craft could project their own image out while becoming stealthy. Then it's like the Star Trek going into warp speed, except the craft is still there, invisible to radar, invisible on the visible spectrum.
One of the most interesting cases I think was the Phoenix Lights, Bill, without a doubt, it's because of the number of people that's seen it, the number of people and the quantity of the quality and the quantity of the evidence, Bill.
And the way the government tried to cover it up was really almost amateur, right?
Yeah.
At first, Fife Symington, because he's governor, was the head of the Arizona Air National Guard. And Fife Symington had been an Air Force officer, so he knew his craft. He calls up the head of the Arizona Air National Guard, Luke Air Force Base, which is right outside Phoenix. And he says, do you guys have any planes flying this night? General says, no, sir. He goes, did you see that craft? It looks like I don't know anything about it. I didn't see it, but our airport is closed. There's nothing happening here. Sky Harbor, which is the Tempe Phoenix airport, had no knowledge of this. So, according to Fife Symington, the Air National Guard had no planes in the air that night. Then the next day, the Air National Guard says, oh, wait a minute, it was the Maryland National Guard in Project Snowbird. Project Snowbird means you're lying. That's what Snowbird means. It's a false story.
Wow.
In Project Snowbird, they were doing flare drops. Wait. They're doing flare drops in a populated area in March.
No, that doesn't work.
And what do flares do when they fall? They fall.
They fall. Yeah,
They fall. And what keeps flares from dropping like rocks? Parachutes. And in ground illumination flares, right? The GIFs, the ground illumination flares. In these, you could actually see the strings of the parachute as the flares drop. They didn't see these things, but there were two sets of lights. The 8:30 lights were the lights that prompted people to go outside and they saw this craft. The 10:30 lights were totally different. So the National Guard supposedly were dropping flares at 10:30, but that doesn't explain the 8:30 lights at all.
Yeah. Wow.
And then, years after Lynn Kitai did her movie, Dr. Lynn Kitai, the National Guard decides, okay, fine, we're going to demonstrate how the 10:30 lights are flares, and they demonstrate it. And all these people are out with their video cameras, and when they look at them eyeball, they say, this is nothing like the 10:30 lights over Phoenix. When they do the color contrast, the color spectrum, the color is all wrong for flares on the 10:30 lights, because you do have video of them, and they're very different from the regular flares. They weren't flares.
Yeah, without a doubt. You know, you can almost tell the authenticity of a case, Bill, by the cover-up, the lame excuse, the attempt to cover up, the excuse, and then the excuse changes and it gets twisted and then it gets revamped, and that almost seals the authenticity for the case for me, Bill.
That's right. Why do you go crazy about covering something up if there's nothing to cover up?
Exactly.
It doesn't make any sense. And what happened to President Clinton that night? He's with some golfing buddy. Suddenly, he broke his ankle. He's incommunicado.
Wow.
Bill Clinton is incommunicado that night.
Wow.
It was his knee. It was his knee that he hurt or something.
Yeah.
Right. He's incommunicado.
Wow. Fascinating. Bill, we're just at the top of the first hour. We're going to take a quick break there and we'll come back in just a moment because I don't want to start another subject. Otherwise, we'll be going in another 20 minutes.
Okay. I will take a break too and come right back.
Hi, everybody. You're back. Listening to James Swagger, your host for this evening. We're talking to Dr. Bill Birnes, discussing UFOs, UFO hunters, and Bill's career. Hi, welcome back, Bill.
Yes, thank you.
Wow, what a discussion, Bill, we're having. We're going to throw the next one at you. Nazi UFOs. This has to be like a monster area of research as well. A little bit into history as well, but I have no doubt that these guys were prevalent with some technology, Bill. They had to have some sort of a helping hand. The more I look at it, Bill, they had advances in Kevlar, they had advances in rocket technology, and the list is endless, Bill. These guys must have had a helping hand, or at least had some sort of a technology to back engineer, Bill. But I mean, that's the UFO.
One of their scientists, very important scientist called Herman Oberth, right? Very, very important scientist, went to work for NASA. He was part of Operation Paperclip, he was patriated to the United States. He says, this is a public quote now. This is not, right? This is not rumor. This is a quote. Mm-hmm. He says, we were helped by people from other worlds. Now, if you were a skeptic, which you should be, you would say to me, some old German guy says we're helped by people from other worlds. Is there a smidgen, an iota of anything that you could say would corroborate that story? Well, here's what I'd say if asked that question. When NASA began doing all the research on its moon program, its lunar program, it wrote a report, and you could get this online. Mm-hmm. It was a report that documented 500 years of lunar anomalies. It's a fabulous report. I mean, it's incredible. I mean, the Elizabethan playwright Christopher Marlowe saw a UFO on the moon. I mean, fabulous, incredible stuff. In the 1920s, the Germans, this is right after World War I, the Germans were seeing structures on the moon and lights on the moon. They knew something was going on up there. And the British were seeing it too. So from those reports, this is NASA. This is basically a NASA report. You know that the Germans were involved in looking at some anomalous extraterrestrial activity upon the moon. Now, the Germans learned their rocketry from an American scientist called Dr. Robert Goddard in New Mexico. And Werner von Braun was one of his devotees. They brought that technology back to Germany and developed the German rocket program. So on the one hand, we know where they learned their rocketry, okay? They learned it right here in the United States. We know that they had a very heavy plan in Germany, but it wasn't the rocketry itself that really captures your attention. It was the German experiments with exotic weapons. I mean, they had, and I was there, a space facility, a space medicine facility in Poland. Mm-hmm. The guy who ran that facility developed the pressurized spacesuit for NASA. So, I mean, these were, and how do they test the spacesuit? On concentration camp inmates. So, I mean, you have the Germans talking about launching human beings into space, and they actually developed this thing called a rocket plane that would go to the near high in the atmosphere, way above the altitudes, the ceilings of conventional fighters escorting the bombers over Germany. Then they would dive through the squadrons and knock out the bombers. They didn't care about the fighters, but they would knock out the bombers. The fighters couldn't do any damage. They were knocking out the bombers. That was the plan. But they never deployed them. They never used them. The Germans had rocket sleds. They never did that. The other side of the coin, besides the technology, is that the Germans, and this is again the Germans believed from the turn of the century on that the Aryan race came from off planet. In fact, according the Aryan race, according to that mythology, came from a planet called Aldebaran and was nurtured in a place called Thule, Greenland. Hence, the Nazi philosophers, the early spiritually oriented Nazi philosophers, were called the Thule Society. And so the idea that the Germans, the Aryans, were planted on Earth from another planet sent the Germans around the world to find proof of this. They looked in the Vedic texts and saw how the Vimana would like flying saucers, firing beams at each other, using atomic weapons, so that there was some kind of war, this extraterrestrial war on planet Earth. The Germans were really into that in terms of the Nazi philosophy. So imagine that the Germans are developing a kind of very exotic technology to win the war, but yet the stream is that these people are extraterrestrial. They're not from this world. Yeah. And so these come together to have this Nazi mysticism about extraterrestrials, and that's feeding this weapons development. That's why there was a Battle of the Bulge, by the way. Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the German rationales for trying to bottle up the Allied advance in Belgium was that because we were going around Belgium and then going into Germany, and one of the rationales for that is to buy them time. They had deployed in late 1944. They were deploying V-1 bombs, right? Essentially crude cruise missiles, V-1 buzz bombs over England. They were finally able to launch from France, because they couldn't launch them from Germany, from France V-2 rockets that were hitting London. Then their plan was that if they could develop these weapons even more, if they could develop atomic weapons, they could devastate the Allies in the last minutes of the war. That would allow them to turn their attention towards the Russians that were coming through Poland and devastate them. They had a plan to win the war even in the darkest days of 1944 through early 1945. One of those plans involved sending a fleet of U-boats with launch ladders, launch ramps on their foredecks into American waters where they would surface, launch their missiles, launch their V-1 rockets, and submerge and get out of there. So the idea was if they had very powerful weapons, they could bomb New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and Washington, knock these cities out, force the Americans to sue for peace, and then if they could strike a peace with the British, they could turn their attention toward the Russians. Didn't work, but that was their plan. And the weapon they were thinking about was something which they called the Wunderwaffe, the wonder weapon, which was a radioactive device that theoretically could travel in time and change history. And that was the Nazi Bell.
Wow, the Nazi Bell project, yeah. Yeah, didn't they have that concrete structure to hold down the Nazi Bell as well in Poland?
Yeah, the henge. It was called a henge, and even though it looks like the underpinning of the water towers they have, henge means circle, by the way, and even though it looks like one of the standard water towers, it's much, much bigger, and there are no remnants of a water tower there. It was used to hold down this device they were testing outside called the Bell.
Wow, tying down this anti-gravity device. Yeah, and there's electrical cables coming off it as well, wasn't there? And,
yes, there were. And the funny thing about it was the folks at one of the scientists, I think it was Nick Ryder maybe, at BLT Research, was experimenting with the supposedly the theory of propulsion for the Bell. The theory of propulsion with the Bell was that there was this very heavy metal, this liquid metal, red mercury. And by having two counter-rotating cylinders rotating in opposite directions very fast, the reaction of that heavy metal would generate a radioactive field so intense that if you could control that radioactive field, you had an enormous source of power. Was this a German version of an atomic bomb? Was this a time travel device? We don't know. But what this one person at BLT Research, this one scientist, did was he very gingerly began experimenting with counter-rotating liquid heavy metals. And sure enough, he developed a radioactive field. And he stopped because it was very dangerous.
Do you think these guys escaped with this technology, or some of the technology, either the Bell, some of the UFO, their technology down to Antarctica even? Do you look into that at all?
There are two theories. One is we believe that the Nazi, first of all, when the Russians got to the Owl Mountains in Poland, there was no Nazi Bell. It was gone.
Yeah.
And we were in the cave where it was being built. We stood there in the cave, seeing all the cables and stuff in this cave, the German machine gun nest to guard it. And so it was gone. So was the Bell flown out of Poland on a huge Junkers bomber to the South Pole, where supposedly, or to South America, the South Pole, where supposedly this went into this land underneath the South Pole that the Germans, that the Saxons had inhabited centuries before, called New Swabia, and where a lot of the Nazis went. That's why they went to South America. Or the person in charge of the development of the Bell was an SS officer. He was an electrical engineer, but he was an SS officer, and his name was Kurt Davis. Right? That's this person. Kurt Davis disappears with the Bell. Where does he wind up? In NASA in the 1960s as one of the directors. He's a launch control director at Cape Kennedy. Suddenly, a guy who's an SS officer running a prison camp is now a NASA director. And this guy and NASA show up in December 1965 when the strange bell-shaped, artillery-shaped object, glowing blue, does a long S-curve and lands in a ditch in Kecksburg, Pennsylvania.
Yeah,
How did he do that?
Kecksburg, yeah, I think these guys could have just popped into existence again. The thing is, if you're going to travel in a craft like that, Bill, you're traveling through time and space. It's like, you could jump 10 years and you wouldn't even know it, like.
Right, and then back in 2008, a strange bell-shaped, artillery-shaped craft comes to a relatively soft landing in a ditch alongside the Colorado River outside Needles, California.
Wow.
People see it. People see it.
Wow.
And what they see is a series of U.S. military helicopters and a sky crane over the object, which is still glowing blue, by the way, and hauling it away. So, and then Lake Mojave, which is nearby, is a test facility for advanced weapons. Did something overshoot Lake Mojave and land in Needles? But here's the other thing where George Knapp gets involved. A strange bunch of very tough-looking guys in black suits and black helmets riding black vehicles with mounted machine guns on them show up in town and start talking to a lot of people. What'd you see? When'd you see it? I wouldn't talk about this if I were you. And Knapp confronts them on the road, and it turns out these guys are from the Atomic Energy Commission, Department of Energy. These guys are there to secure atomic weapons.
Wow.
What are they doing in Needles, California?
Wow. George Knapp's an interesting guy. I like George Knapp. Very, very prolific investigative journalist. He doesn't mess about. He just wants to get to the truth and to the knowledge, and prolific guy.
Right, but he comes out to Needles to find out what's going on out there.
I'm fully convinced that the tall blonde thing is like, these guys are another race, and there's so many examples of this, Bill, from South America, the Germans. I mean, it's like all over. Like, I have no doubt. There's a few cases in America as well where people say they meet tall blonde beings and that they look very, very similar to us, Bill.
Well, that's what I've heard too. People have said to me that, in fact, the chapter I'm writing now about the Greys conspiracy, we talked to this one person, Marian Colasandro, who said that it's the tall Greys, not the tall Greys, but the tall Nordics, these Nordic-looking beings that are the ones that really control. There are different species, but these are the ones that really control the little Greys, the android-like Greys who do their work. That's how these different races work together. And these Nordic beings showed her these devastating visions of planet Earth after climate change.
Yeah. She's coming on the show, Bill. She's coming on the show.
Oh, she is?
Yeah, start of March. I'm looking forward to it. I spoke to her the other night. Lovely lady.
Good.
Lovely lady. So I'll be looking forward to that show. Let's switch gears again, Bill. Let's talk about aviation industry, because if there's anybody going to recognize what a UFO looks like, it's going to be somebody in the aviation industry. And there's been several dogfights as well between UFOs where, military planes have tried to take these guys down. I think, I don't know about the rest of the world, but certainly America, I think the guys would shoot these things down if they could, Bill, because they want the technology.
Well, we have. If you talk to Frank Ficino, who's a great interview, by the way, he's a great guest. If you talk to Frank Ficino, who wrote the book Shoot 'Em Down, then Frank Ficino will tell you that in July 1952, that summer, Stan Friedman calls 1952 the summer of the saucers. They were all over the place, and especially over Washington, D.C. And we intercepted them, and we know that there was incursion because we have the photographs of that incursion. We have these echelon formations of flying saucers over the Washington Monument, over the Capitol building. So they were over Washington. And we did send our top jets and top fighter pilots against them. And we brought some of them down. One craft crash landed out in West Virginia, outside of in Braxton County, outside of Flatwoods, and Frank did an incredible job of amassing the witnesses, interviewing the witnesses, and piecing together. It's a great story. Piecing together what happened when this alien craft crashed in Braxton County, outside of Flatwoods. It's called the Flatwoods Monster, and sent this defensive. It had this defensive kind of robot-like device that scoured the area to keep people away, while other craft came in to take it away. So this is a phenomenal story. So we have shot these things down.
I think as an engineer, Bill, what we could do with the technology, how could we back engineer it? And I just think this stuff's so advanced, there's very little we could grapple with. I think there's very little that. But I think, that wouldn't care to the military organizations of the world. They would have, if they could only back engineer 1% of this stuff. Bill,
well, here's what here's what supposedly is going on. First of all, you have a lot of people in quasi-NGO military relationships who are actively doing research on things like dark matter and dark energy. And among the comments that I have heard is that for all the flying saucers they said we've retrieved, none of those craft are propelled by dark energy. So there's a little kind of, it's like, oh, wow, you guys got a flying saucer. Oh, gee, there's no dark energy propulsion system. So it's a very funny, good news, bad news kind of thing. Mm-hmm. The other thing we know is that the UFO intelligence is handled by elements in the government called special access projects. And there are special access units within all areas of the military, NASA, places like that. John Schuessler told me that, head of MUFON. And supposedly there is one office in the Pentagon, one of the undersecretaries of defense, who is that's the desk where all this intelligence material lands. So we do have a UFO officer. Air Force bases also have UFO officers. We found this out from Edwards Air Force Base back in the 1960s, that there are UFO officers at Air Force bases. So this is not a deep, dark secret within the military. So the point is, we know this stuff, and the military is dealing with this stuff in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, the aviation industry too, we've got a lot of great eyewitness testimony from pilots. And these guys, they're trying to protect their career. They can't speak out. There's like a unwritten thing where they can't speak out. It's not like they're told not to, but, they're going to be shunned in their careers. But some of them have, Bill, and some of the radar imagery and testimony that we have backs up the radar imagery. Some of these cases are pretty intense, like.
Well, they are. One of my favorite cases is the RB-47 case from 1957, when a UFO, and this case has been debunked, and the debunkers keep falling short of the facts. In fact, the debunking raises levels of implausibility to impossible heights. Here's a case where an object, we don't know what it is, starts tracking the RB-47, which in 1947 was probably the most sophisticated electronic counter-warfare plane in existence, with crews, and the radar guys were called scarecrows or ravens, that were the most highly trained in the Air Force. So here is an event that is where the plane tracks it on its very sophisticated radar systems. It's tracked from the ground, and it's tracked visually by the pilots in the cockpit. And that's an incredible, and there are all kinds of reports on this thing. An incredible case. Then there's the case of the Iranian pilot, he became a general, Parviz Jafari, who was dispatched to protect a guy in his squad. He's flying an F-4 Phantom jet. And he's dispatched to bring back some guy in his squadron who's flying too close to the border with Russia, to the Soviet border. The guy says he's chasing a UFO. Parviz Jafari says, get back here. The Russians, if some MiG comes over, you're a dead man. He goes to get it, and he sees the UFO. And he starts tracking the UFO over the Iranian desert towards Tehran. And finally, he's given orders to engage the UFO. Well, suddenly the UFO emits a huge craft. It emits a smaller craft from some kind of a landing bay inside. It emits a smaller craft, and the craft starts tracking the F-4 Phantom. So Parviz Jafari goes, this is a dogfight. He turns his plane, and he goes to arm his missile launching facility, his air-to-air missiles. Suddenly, his radio goes static. He loses control of his planes, and worse, his missile launch board goes dead. He's lost control of the plane. So he goes to break off. He gains control of the plane again. He's told, shoot this thing. It goes back, tries to get it, and the thing starts tracking him. 1 second, it's on one side of the plane. Another second, it's on another side of the plane. Jafari can't keep track of it. Finally, he's told to break off and head for home, and the thing lands in the desert. That was taken so seriously that when he returns to base, I think it's at Marienbad, when he returns to base, he's met not only by members of the Iranian Air Force General Staff, but he's met by uniformed United States Air Force officers and people in plain clothes for a debriefing. The story of that encounter by Parviz Jafari, we now know, because we have the data, we have the proof, winds up being presented in 1976 to President Gerald Ford. And that's among the things delivered to President Jimmy Carter when he takes office in 1977.
Fascinating, Bill. This is all fascinating. You know, so many different, this is a minefield of research, Bill, isn't it? It's like there's so much evidence out there. I mean, I don't know why people just don't wake up and look at this stuff and go, hang on a minute. You know, a lot of people just want to put their head in the sand, Bill, and ostracize themselves and not deal with this, or they want to figure out, you know, where they're going to get their next meal from and are they going to pay their bills this week. And, you know, we've got brothers and sisters in this galaxy, Bill. And that's the way I see it. You know,
right. I mean, this is all true. And the CIA has made it very difficult for you to be kind of an above board, honest broker in the ufology movement, because as early as after the 1947 crash, the government didn't know what they wanted to do. I mean, they were as befuddled as anybody. So they pulled together the staff from Air War College. Among them was a lieutenant colonel called Marion Magruder, who'd been the commander of his own squadron of night fighters in World War II in the South Pacific. So they take these classes to Wright Field, where the alien debris wound up and where the live alien wound up. And the point was that the members of these classes had to write up their ideas for strategy about this. We didn't know if it was a threat or not, but about this alien threat. I'll just call it that because we didn't know. And all these officers, the most prevalent types of theses that they began writing were theses about the development of tactical nuclear weapons. Odd that they would do that. But they saw this. So we had no policy in 1948. Finally, evolving in 1949 and 1950, the various projects, Grudge and Sign, all began to formulate a policy so that by the time Eisenhower was taking office in early 1953, and remember, Eisenhower had his own UFO sighting when he was on the deck of the Franklin Delano, the USS FDR, in Operation Mainbrace in the North Atlantic in 1952. So Eisenhower gets this briefing about the fact that there are really live aliens, and we've had encounters with off-planet species. And so finally, the CIA, if you read the history, again, online, develops a plan that you're not going to tell people that UFOs don't exist. I mean, you could say that all you want to, and they have, but the other way to do it is to have a 2 or 3-pronged approach. One, take all the things you know to be true about UFOs and alien landings and give it to Hollywood. Because if Hollywood is making motion pictures about it, like Day of the Triffids and things like that, if Hollywood is making motion pictures about it, people look at it as fiction as opposed to reality. Fictionalize it to marginalize it.
Yeah.
2, you let you make fun of people who claim to be UFO witnesses, contactees, abductees, etc. They become objects of ridicule. Sure. And 3, you flood the airwaves with disinformation about UFOs so that people believe all the wrong things. Yeah. And it worked.
Yeah. You know, on the other side, and just as you mentioned Hollywood, you had Dan Aykroyd come out and do the DVD with David Sarita. You know, he he's a believer in UFOs, like, so at least that's...
Well, he was a witness. I mean, he tells the story. He was living near upper New York State, and he said he wakes up and he feels this huge urge to go out into the night. This was a cover story in UFO magazine, this huge urge to go out into the night, and he sees hundreds of people staring at this huge UFO in the sky. So he believes because he's seen it.
Yeah. Yeah, and he wants the truth, and he wants to get to the bottom of it, like, you know, and so he's like another voice, and that's good to see that, Bill, because he's got some media behind him, you know, and media attention, so not that that's necessary for credibility, but, you know, it's, at least it kind of takes the Hollywood thing down a notch. Not much, but it takes it down a notch.
Right. I mean, not that much, because Hollywood is still doing these movies, but, yeah. You know, even things like the only way you can tell the truth is fiction. So you've got Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where you have a story about, ostensibly, this is what John Schuster told me, a real UFO landing all the way back in the 1960s. And this is that story, but it's fictionalized.
Do you remember another great case is the Japanese... I talked to my dad about this a lot. He's my UFO fellow researcher, and I've been enlightened to this as a kid and stuff, but... you know, the Japanese flight that went over Alaska, I think it was 1628 it was, where...
Yes, yeah. JAL 1628.
Yeah, what a case this one, Bill.
Well, and again, the backstory on that is multiple witnessed UFO on radar, witnessed, picked up, by the way, by the United States Air Force. They picked it up on their radar. They were over Alaska, and the thing hovered, buzzed the plane, observed the plane, and then split off. Well, the person who was in charge of that investigation for the FAA was a man called John Callahan, who I met. John Callahan amassed radar tapes, videotapes, the audio tapes from the conversations, amassed the whole thing. And they're having a meeting about this at FAA headquarters. Who walks in? The CIA. They say to Callahan and the assembled group, hand us the tapes. Luckily, Callahan kept copies. Hand us the tapes. This meeting never took place. We were never here. There's no such thing as JAL as that flight, seeing a UFO. Wow. Erase it from your memories, and they leave.
Wow.
Next person who pops up is, of course, the very famous Dr. Bruce Maccabee, the United States Navy photo expert. The CIA gives all that information to Maccabee and says, here, you figure this out. And Bruce Maccabee writes that very famous report on the JAL flight, which folks can get at Bruce Maccabee's site on the internet.
Yeah. You know, and the pilot was pretty concerned too, wasn't he? He was pretty concerned.
He was freaking out.
Yeah, this is what makes this, you know, the guy was being tailed by UFOs and he couldn't shake them off, and he was getting pretty concerned. He was in panic mode, like.
Right. Well, I mean, if you see enough Japanese science fiction movies, you know, the next thing is the UFO beams you up and that's the end of you.
Exactly. Wow. You know, Area 51, as it's nicknamed, you know, it's being decommissioned, Bill. Do we think there's the Area 52?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's one at Dugway Proving Grounds. We were there. We saw this invisibility thing going on there. It was astounding. There are cattle mutilations. People who are tribal police from Utah have been on the perimeter of the base and have described UFOs hovering over the base.
Wow. Why do you need to go to Utah, Bill, with Area 52? More secrecy, better cover-up, too much press at Area 51, all of the above?
Right. I mean, they acquired a lot. And Area 52, remember, that Dugway Proving Ground base was an operational base during World War II. And what were they developing at Dugway? Poison gas. Because if you go up there, we were there. If you go up there, you will see all the poison gas detectors ringing the base so that they would know if any gas leaked. We were planning a poison gas attack against Japan during World War II. And before we get too high-minded, the Japanese were sending exploding balloon bombs called fugus over the United States across the Pacific from Japan in World War II. Some of them exploded, and they were laced with anthrax. So we were under biological attack by Japan in World War II. And that's why Area 52, Dugway Proving Grounds, was developing poison gas to be used against the Japanese. When we went there, they knew we were coming. We were there twice. I'm telling you, helicopters all over the place.
World War II was an interesting time for ufology, wasn't it, Bill? It all kicked off then. Do you think the UFOs have stepped in and said, right, these guys have nuclear warheads now. These guys are in trouble. They're going to wipe themselves out. Do you think that's the reason that we're starting to see the increase of UFOs?
Well, wherever you see a nuclear facility, you tend to see UFOs hovering. I mean, it's just during World War II, they were hovering over Hanford. They were hovering over Oak Ridge. We know they were over Los Alamos. And, of course, we have the Roswell crash. So they've been around. They were over United States Air Force Base at Malmstrom in Montana in 1965, shut down the whole missile silo. They were over Soviet missile sites, actually armed a series of missiles in Soviet silos. The Soviets lost control of their missiles. These things were going off. They were going off to start a nuclear war. Moscow couldn't even intervene to shut these things down. Finally, they released their control, and the Russians were able to shut down the missiles. They're letting us know they will not allow us to have a nuclear war.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Battle of Los Angeles in World War II as well. What a case that built. I mean, these guys, anti-tank shrapnel, these guys fired everything at this UFO and they couldn't shoot it down though.
Right, and it was hovering. And you want to say, wait a minute, if it's a balloon, how could all of our anti-aircraft gunners have missed a balloon? That makes no sense. It was flying against the wind anyway, so it wasn't a balloon. There was shrapnel all over I have a piece of shrapnel somewhere in this house, all over the beach. Mm-hmm. Somebody said, oh, it's a piece of a UFO. I looked at it and said, no, it's not. It's shrapnel from an anti-aircraft shell. The shells landed back on the beach and exploded. So no, and then they covered the whole thing up.
Yeah, I mean, they fired everything they got. I mean, there was casualties as well. I mean, but these guys were
people were hit by shrapnel from falling shells.
It's a mass, again, Bill, another example of a mass sighting, and it's like, the list goes on and on, Bill. What do you think of the whole abduction thing? Do you think there's cases that are people were contacted and experiences and genuine and neither good or bad outcome, but then there's cases where there's like experiments and ill intent or...
Well, you're talking to Miriam in a few weeks, and so you'll hear firsthand. Mm-hmm. I mean, you'll hear firsthand what she has to say about her contacts with alien creatures. But I mean, for me, if there were nothing else, there's the Barney and Betty Hill case up in Exeter.
Oh, yeah.
New Hampshire.
Yeah, let's talk about your Barney Hill case, Bill. I've had Kathleen Martin on the show, and you probably obviously know Kathleen, but what a case this is, Bill. This is, if there was nothing else, this is the case to have a look at.
Exactly. And Kathy makes a really good point about if this were only, first of all, she dispels one myth. The big myth was always that Betty and Barney never knew what happened to them until they saw Dr. Benjamin Simon, and he was able to elicit memories from them about what happened. Kathy dispels that myth right up. She says the next morning after they'd gotten home, Betty called her sister, Kathy's mom, and told her the whole story, and Kathy got on the phone. So she knew about it. The only thing that Betty didn't know was what happened after the little grays, the little creatures, led her up to a ramp, up to a craft. They led her up and they led Barney up. But these things crept through. I mean, Barney complained about the sores on his genitals. He couldn't figure out how he got them. He had hypertension. But he didn't have any other physical elements. Nobody knew why, and that was why he went to a doctor in the first place, to find out what was wrong with him. And then when he recovered those memories, he remembered that the creatures in the craft put the suction device over his genital area, and they sucked cells, sperm cells out of him, which they were going to use in hybridization.
Mm-hmm.
Betty talks about a long, thin tube being inserted into her womb and liquid being extracted.
Yeah, and that medical procedure wasn't known at the time either, Bill, was it?
That's right. That wasn't known for another 10, 15 years. Yeah. Amniocentesis is what it's called today. So that was one. She couldn't have possibly known about the existence of amniocentesis back in 1961. Then she talks about the chart that this was a very benevolent, I mean, it was hostile because it was against their will, but ultimately they were not subjected to torture. I mean, she talks about this chart, and one of the entities, seemingly one of the head entities, tells her where they're from, and it's this twin star. Well, people, no twin stars, no, it can't be. Then they discovered the twin stars of Zeta Reticuli, and they discovered the planets around Zeta Reticuli of the twin star. Again, not known in 1961, known by the 1980s.
Yeah.
Then, of course, there are the stains on the Betty Hill dress, the pink protein stains on her desk, where she remembers they grabbed her, and of course the damage to the car and everything else.
Yeah, the magnetic anomalies on the car and all. There's so much evidence there. You know, it's, for me, the star map as a physicist and an astronomer, that's what I do. And it's like the fact that a school teacher, Bill, cracked the star map against the odds, because back then, I mean, you had to do it all by hand. There was no number crunching on fancy computers like we have with this fancy software today. It was all old school, Bill, and you know, it was nice that she did that. Like, she had the sense to say, well, if this exists, it's got to be out there. Let's look for it.
That's right, because she took Betty Hill's story seriously.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, sometimes people just want to wash this all away, Bill, you know. Bill, I want to talk a little bit about, just before we wrap up, I want to talk a little bit about Ancient Aliens. How did you get into the Ancient Aliens thing? Did that follow on from the UFO hunters? Do you do any more episodes today, or?
I'm not doing episodes now, but that kind of is a funny story. The whole Ancient Aliens idea was really something that Pat and Uskert and I were pushing the network to do. This is before Giorgio. Mm-hmm. We're pushing the network to do as early as the first season. We said, look, with all the ancient alien sites around the world, and we talked about some of the exact same sites you did, James, with all of them around the world, we should do at least one episode on the possibility that aliens visited our planets tens of thousands of years ago, and the network was highly resistant. Finally, it's now the first episode of season 3. And we're doing the story of giant triangles. I love that episode because we actually Mark Olson captured a giant triangle on video. And we had Terence Masson try to find any way to call this conventional, and he couldn't. It was, by definition, a UFO. So it was, each season we found a UFO. Mm-hmm. So now we want to see, so we interviewed Giorgio, and the setup was, Giorgio wanted to show us this artifact. He was wearing this, or I still have it somewhere, this artifact of something that looked like a bird, but it's not a bird. Its wings were in the wrong place. They're too far back off the shoulders. The tail was all wrong. Birds don't have tails like that. Mm-hmm. So he shows it to me. I said, it looks like a space shuttle. I mean, it's just like a space shuttle. Why, you know? He said, Bill, this is an artifact from 1,000 years ago in Mesoamerica. I said, it can't be.
Yeah.
That's the space shuttle. Well, here's the test. Will it fly? We go to Brick Price. We show him the little piece of jewelry that Giorgio has. He scales it up to something that might a decent size. We launch it on a catapult. It flies.
Wow.
It flies.
Wow. Yeah, now, I remember the scaled model. It was like a little model plane, exactly scaled to the right dimensions and all.
Yeah, so it's flying. So the network sees that, right? And then says, let's do a show based on that. And that's how Ancient Aliens got started as a series. And they asked me to help launch the series and be in the first episodes, which I were.
Wow. Yeah, some of the stuff I don't agree with, some of the stuff I do. I love the whole ancient astronaut theory because when you look at the Sumerian culture, Bill, and you look at the ancients and the records, it's all there, Bill. It's there in modern times and it's there in ancient times. And we've been visited by, a variety of cultures from across the galaxy, Bill, for a very, very long time. God only knows how far back, Bill.
Yeah, I don't know how far back, but I mean, look, now they've just found a design for the Ark. So instead of the Ark being the boat-shaped, right, bow and stern that it was a huge circle.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, look at all the cultures that talk about the flood. So this is not just some kind of a story that's a myth. It probably really happened when the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea ran into each other.
Mm-hmm.
And there probably was an Ark that grounded on Mount Ararat. And that story, which was a Mesopotamian story, found its way into the because there was the Jewish community and there was an ancient community in Mesopotamia, found its way into the Bible.
Yeah, no doubt, Bill. Do you look into the Dogon much? Have you looked at that?
I have for Ancient Aliens, as a matter of fact. We did, and it was the Dogon fertility dances and the ceremonial dances with the space helmets they were wearing. Those square, boxy space helmets on their heads. And, of course, the Dogons migrated from ancient Egypt.
Yeah.
They're Egyptian.
Yeah.
And they migrated across North Africa from ancient Egypt. And they're doing this ceremonial dance commemorating an extraterrestrial encounter.
They got circumcision as well, like the Jewish community, and they just look like they've been dropped out of somewhere else and put there. Their folklore or history. I don't like calling it folklore, but most people refer to it as that. But there's a couple of authors, Shannon Dory and Laird Scranton, have tackled them, and very few people will address the Dogon stuff. But when you read the stuff, Bill, it's like I have no doubt that a group of people came from the Pleiades and seeded us on one occasion anyway. Maybe there's been a multitude of peoples that have come.
Well, I think there have been multiple seedings.
Yeah, I think, against the odds we might have been. Look at the Earth. I mean, we do go through cataclysms, Bill. I think there's a reseeding of the Earth that happens because of cataclysmic events.
I tend to agree with you.
Whether that is, done with good intent or bad intent, I don't know. A lot of people talk about we were used as slave species, and I don't even care about that, Bill, because I'm not a slave anyway today, but because I don't buy into the commercial aspect of life, but there are people that do that, and we are slaves to the Western money system in a way. But setting that aside, it doesn't really matter what we were used for or reseeded. The fact is that it happened. And people need to wake up to that. People need to wake up to this.
First of all, I think there's more than one fertilization that has gone on, so that there are very different types of human beings on the planet. We do share the same DNA. There's no doubt about that. But I do think that we've been visited. Different cultures were visited at different times with different levels of technology imparted to those cultures. I fully believe that, and I fully believe that we are the alien species on the planet. Human beings are the alien species.
What do you think of the moon thing? Do you think the moon has been used as a base then, Bill? As observation, or, transport?
Well, if you look at the stories of the hidden NASA, right? All the stories about activities on the moon, stories that I've heard from NASA people about structures on the moon that were covered up because nobody wants you to know that there are structures on the moon, that the moon rings like a bell when we have shot rods into it to get a seismic reading off the moon.
Yeah.
That there are alien artifacts on the dark side of the moon, that the United States, as far back as 1956, I have the documentation. 1956. Anybody can get it, by the way. It's online, and it's also in the back of Day After Roswell. In 1956, the Army decided to launch a project to establish a fortified base on the moon. Fortified. It wasn't some NASA lunar lander. This was a fortified base on the moon.
Wow.
And that was abandoned. They never did it. And even after we went to the moon in 1969 and successive missions through the 1970s, we abruptly stopped our moon exploration after billions of dollars were spent. For what possible purpose? We stopped. And the purpose of that was to mine the moon that's rich in minerals. I believe we were told in no uncertain terms, get off, stay off, and don't come back.
Yeah, I think that too, Bill. I think we've been warned off the moon. You know, we can barely run our planet, Bill. Look what we do to the planet. The planet's been raped for all its resources and not managed either in a very good way. I think that the Earth is a very abundant place, but I think, you know, it's not managed very well. Now, obviously, there's people in power that are doing that. I understand that, but I think if we can't manage the Earth, Bill, I don't think we're allowed to touch the moon. I think that's the rule.
Well, even Stephen Hawking has said, in order for the human race to survive, it has to populate other planets.
Yeah. Yeah, we're going to have to be able to colonize, because at some point we're going to be meeting a very, very serious threat, like an asteroid or something, like, you know. Bill, we're coming up to the top of the second hour here. You know, you got any conferences? You got yourself on Dark Matter Radio as well? You want to give out the website for
Dark
that?
Matter we're on Dark Matter Radio. We're on PSN with our radio show Future Theater on Monday nights at 7:00. I've got a book. I've got a book that I'm finishing now. It's the second book of the UFO Hunters series that's coming out probably next year. I've got a book on violent crime in America coming out next year as well. And so those are my projects.
Wow.
I'm going to be I've got 3 conferences coming up next year where I'll be. One is at the Presidio Conference with Ruben Uriarte. That's in October. Another in July is the MUFON conference here in New Jersey, in Cherry Hill, New Jersey.
Mm-hmm.
And the third conference is as early as April, and that's going to be in Florida with Antonio Paris talking about the aerial phenomenon.
Wow. Busy guy, Bill. Busy guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great, Bill. That's great. I'm going to have to definitely get you back on the show, Bill, at some point anyway, for sure.
Well, I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, and it's great to see you. I've tuned in a couple of times on Dark Matter Radio and, PSN too. And,
sure.
You know, great to be part of that network too, Bill. And, I like the guys there. I get a great reception there, great audio quality, great professionality. And they got a great bunch of hosts there too, Bill. So
they do. It's a really strong network, and I'm looking forward to seeing it grow and grow.
Yeah, and that's the way it's going. It's growing and growing. So
yes.
Bill, thank you for your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Well, thank you, James. Very informed. A couple of hours. Thank you.